When my dad got sick with cancer and I went to visit him, I could see that he was dying. His eyes looked different. They looked far away as if they belonged in another world. The rest of my family was in denial, and I knew that it was now or never. It was time for me to sit down with him and have the difficult conversations that we'd all been avoiding. Did he want to be on hospice? Did he want to have a memorial? Did he want to be cremated? He didn't have answers to any of these things, and he said, whatever your stepmom wants. And I was like, hell no. You are not going to put the hardest decisions we will ever have to make back on us because it's too uncomfortable to think about. I got answers to those questions, but I was left with needing more reassurance. I wanted to know that whatever happens after this life isn't so far away. I wanted something to hang on to. My dad was an animal lover, and with tears streaming down my face, I asked him what animal he would visit us as, and he said, an eagle. And my stepmom said, when the fuck are we ever going to see an eagle? My dad joked about it for weeks. He said, I'll come back as a crow or a pig or something you'll see all the time, and it carried us through the next couple months. My dad was many things. He was an emergency room doctor, he was a writer, he was a nature photographer, and a bird watcher. The love for animals and birds must have passed through my family's lineage because he always told me that my grandmother loved birds. And when she met my grandfather, they loved hunting them. They both became bird watchers. One morning, I was sitting next to my dad, and he turned to me and said, you and I have a date tonight at 8. And I said, okay, I'll be there. But my dad was bedridden at the time and nearing his final days of life. That afternoon, I went on a hike with my sister in the redwoods behind my family's home. We were on an overgrown path a couple miles up into the mountains, and out of nowhere, a huge vulture flies out of the tree, making the most ominous cawing noise I have ever heard. That only meant there was imminent danger ahead. We stop in our tracks, and 10 feet from us, behind a huge bush, we hear snapping branches. They could only be the sound of a bear. We couldn't remember what type of bear you're supposed to run for your life from and which type you're supposed to climb a tree away from. So we walk as quietly as we can, back the way we came, which we wouldn't have done if we had not had that near encounter with the bear. On the way back, I notice a hawk feather covered in mud, and there's something that feels significant about finding this feather. When my sister and I look up the meaning, we find that feathers are supposed to represent postcards from the spirit realm, and finding a hawk feather means listen to your intuition. I show up at 7:45 early for my bedside date with my dad, but he's not really responsive at this point. I hold his hand and I sit there with him. At 8:15, the family cat jumps into his lap, and this is the first time that I don't see my father's face grimace in pain. I'm sitting there holding his hand, and I see my dad pull his oxygen mask out of his face, and I ask him, you don't want that? And he says, nah. A moment of clarity washes over me, and I realize that the date at 8 meant that he was ready to let go. I ask him if he feels complete, and he says, yeah. My birthday happened 2 weeks after my dad passed away, which was frankly way too soon to have a birthday. I was doing anything I could to process through the pain, and on my birthday I went to a sound healing, which is a musical event that's facilitated by somebody who plays different indigenous instruments, and you just lie there and you breathe and you try to process and feel your feelings. At the end of the sound healing, the woman passed me a Native American rattle. I held it in my hand and she told me to shake it around my body and clear my energy. I flipped the rattle over, and on the back of it was a painted eagle. About an hour later, I was at my friend's house, and I noticed a book of vintage bird drawings. I pulled the book out. It was the kind of book that you would look at before that there were photographs of birds to identify them, and I grew up drawing birds, so it was something that was interesting to me. I pulled the book out, and I opened it to a full page of an eagle. My dad's memorial was a couple months after he passed away. We wanted to celebrate it on his birthday, and we all just needed a break from the pain. I knew that I wanted to speak at the memorial, but it was really hard to just sit down and write the words because it meant that it was real. The memorial was held outside in the foothills of Sonoma County in Northern California. And when I went up to speak, I told the audience about how my dad would come back as an eagle, and how when I was on a road trip in New Mexico, a stranger came up to me and told me that he saw feathers falling all around me. And from that moment on, I had found feathers almost every other day. I was speaking, and I noticed something above my head, and I see a huge winged bird flying over us. And I gasp, and everybody turns around and looks up at the bird, and somebody says, "That's a red-tailed hawk." And we all just watch it fly by and make its hawky noises down on us. And something happens in that moment, and I drop into my body in this ever-present way. My dad had been a wonderful public speaker, and it felt like I was channeling him. I put my hand over my heart, and I look up at the sky as we watch the hawk fly away and say, "Onwards and upwards, newly winged one." My dad was a writer, and he had been working on a book for 25 years called The Hunt for Blackfoot Lion that was about a mountain lion that was stalking a Native American tribe in Montana. And one of the wonderful things that happened the year that he had been sick and was being treated for cancer was that he finally got to publish this book. He got a bestseller sticker, and it was one of the great moments of joy that we had as a family celebrating his success. My dad loved mountain lions, and I knew that they existed in the town that I grew up in. I had never seen one. The night of my dad's memorial, my brother and I are leaving, driving to our cousin's house. We're on a back wine country road. We turn a corner, and in the middle of the road is a mountain lion. What I understood was that eagles were a little too endangered for him to send, but he sent the next best thing. It took me a long time to sit down and read my dad's book. I knew that his words would bring me comfort, but I was too loyal to the pain, and I wasn't ready for it yet. My jaw almost dropped off of my face when I finally did sit down to read his book. The patriarch in the book dies, spoiler alert. And in my dad's writing, everybody's gathered at the memorial, and my dad writes, "And they gathered at the memorial, and they watched a hawk fly over them. And they knew that when a hawk flies over at a memorial, it meant that the person's soul was soaring." I started dating a new person who never got to meet my dad. Shout out to Max. He took me on a date to a float tank, which is one of those sensory deprivation isolation chambers where you lie in really salty water. And I was really determined to have a deeply spiritual experience. And during that hour, I felt nothing. I just laid there, trying to blink away the salt that accidentally got into my eyes. And after the float tank experience, Max and I sat in their relaxation room, and I watched him pick up a deck of animal totem cards. He shuffled the cards and fanned them out for me to pick one. Somebody told me recently that when you pick cards like that, like tarot cards or something significant that's supposed to predict your future, you should close your eyes and feel for warmth. And so I did that. And when I drew a card and opened my eyes, I saw that I had drawn the eagle card. Instant tears. And I felt like my dad was trying to tell me, "I like this guy. This is exactly where you're supposed to be." So naturally, we move in together. I learned that when it comes to the hardest task we have as humans, to lay our loved ones to rest, it's important to be a little bit more openness. The openness allowed me to be available to see the gifts of the animals and the birds and the feathers. I learned to walk barefoot in nature. I learned to stop and take 3 breaths before I walked into a room. I learned to hold my hand out and let a monarch land on my fingertips. And I learned to stare a little longer at a woodpecker. My father sends me animals, little winks from the world beyond, letting me in on the great mystery. Thank you.